It was an ordinary day at Westbrook High School. The bell had just rung, signaling the start of third period. The students were scattered across different classrooms, some daydreaming, others busy with their notes. Everything seemed calm, almost too calm, until the loudspeaker crackled to life. Attention all staff and students. We are going into lockdown. This is not a drill. Everyone froze. It was strange. The lockdown drills usually happened in the morning or after lunch, never in the middle of a class. A nervous buzz filled the room as the teacher quickly locked the door, pulling down the blinds. Students exchanged confused glances, whispering to each other. Was it a prank? Was there a real danger? The teacher, Mr. Wilson, motioned for everyone to stay quiet, his face serious. The tension in the room was thick, like you could almost touch it. No one knew what was happening, but everyone felt the same chill running down their spines. Suddenly, there was a faint sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was like footsteps, but too soft to be normal. They seemed to echo in the hallway just outside the classroom. Mr. Wilson turned his head, listening intently. The students, now fully alert, listened too. The tapping continued, growing louder and closer. "What is that?" whispered one of the girls from the back. Her voice trembled, matching the fear that was slowly building in the room. Everyone held their breath as the footsteps stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that made your heart pound in your chest. The kind that makes every small sound seem terrifying. Then, there was again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, the footsteps were right outside the door. The doorknob rattled, making a low clicking sound, as if someone was trying to get in. Mr. Wilson gestured for everyone to stay absolutely still. Not a word, not a movement. It felt like time itself had frozen. The only thing anyone could hear was the sound of their own breathing, shallow and fast. The door shook again, but whoever or whatever was outside didn't come in. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The tension was unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps faded away. But the fear remained. Something had been out there, something not right. No one knew what it was, but they all knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over yet. A few days later, another lockdown happened. This time, it was during gym class. The students were running laps when the announcement came. Lockdown. This is not a drill. Coach Davis quickly ushered everyone into the locker room. The students huddled together, confused and scared. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning. "Stay quiet," Coach whispered, his voice low and serious. He locked the door and stood by it, listening for any sign of danger. But then, something strange happened. One of the students, Jake, pointed towards a small window at the top of the locker room wall. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Everyone turned to look. At first, no one saw anything. But then, there it was, a shadow. It moved quickly, darting across the window. "Who's out there?" whispered another student, eyes wide with fear. Coach Davis frowned. He walked slowly towards the window, trying to get a better look. But as he got closer, the shadow vanished. "Stay back," he warned. No one moved. For what felt like an eternity, they all stood frozen, staring at the window, waiting for the shadow to return. But it didn't. Instead, there was a new sound, faint at first but growing louder. It was the sound of something being dragged across the floor just outside the locker room. The students huddled together, holding their breath. The sound came closer, closer, until it stopped right outside the door. Coach Davis stood still, his hand on the doorknob, as if ready to fight off whatever was out there. But nothing happened. The dragging sound stopped, and the room fell silent again. Minutes passed, and slowly the tension eased. But no one could shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. Even after the lockdown was lifted, that shadow in the window stayed in their minds. What was it? No one knew, but it felt like it was waiting, and that thought was scarier than anything else. Weeks passed without any more lockdowns, and the students started to feel safe again. But safety is often an illusion, and sometimes the scariest things happen when you least expect them. It was a rainy afternoon at Lincoln Middle School. The students were in their last period of the day when the familiar announcement echoed through the halls. "Lockdown. This is not a drill." The students knew the drill. They moved quietly to the corner of the room, away from the windows. Their teacher, Mrs. James, locked the door and pulled the blinds, her face calm but tense. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows, creating a steady rhythm that somehow made everything feel more eerie. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. It was soft, almost like a whisper, coming from the hallway. At first, no one could understand what it was saying, but then the words became clearer. "Let me in. Let me in." The students stared at the door, fear gripping them. Who would say something like that during a lockdown? Mrs. James looked just as scared as the students, but she didn't move. The voice continued, its tone pleading. Please, let me in. The voice was strange, not like any voice they had heard before. It sounded distant, almost like it was coming from somewhere deep inside the building, even though it was just outside the door. One of the students, a boy named Ethan, whispered, Do you think it's real? No one answered. The fear was too strong. The voice kept whispering, but no one dared to move. The sound seemed to grow louder, more desperate. Let me in. Please. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the voice to go away, but it didn't. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence after the whispering was almost worse than the voice itself. The student sat frozen, too terrified to even breathe loudly. Mrs. James stood by the door, her hand still gripping the lock tightly. She was trying to stay calm, but even the smallest noise outside seemed to make her flinch. Minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. The only sound now was the rain, still tapping softly against the window. Some students glanced nervously at each other, while others kept their eyes glued to the door, half expecting something or someone to try and get in. And then out of nowhere, the lights flickered, once, twice, and then the room plunged into darkness. A few students gasped and someone whispered, Oh no! Mrs. James fumbled for her phone to use as a light. But before she could turn it on, someone else in the room spoke up. Do you see that? It was a girl sitting by the window. Everyone turned to look in the direction she was pointing, and that's when they saw it. Two glowing eyes staring at them from the darkness. The eyes were just outside the window, hovering there, almost like they were watching the students. A wave of fear swept through the room. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move. They just stared unblinking, and the students felt as if those eyes could see straight into their souls. Is that someone outside? A boy whispered. His voice shook with fear. No, it can't be, another student replied. We're on the second floor. That realization made it even worse. How could something be staring at them from a window that high off the ground? Mrs. James shone her phone's flashlight toward the window, but the moment the light hit the glass, the eyes vanished. The students let out a collective breath, but no one felt any safer. Stay calm, Mrs. James whispered, though her own voice trembled. It's probably just a trick of the light. But no one believed that. Everyone knew that what they had seen wasn't normal. The lights flickered back on, but the eerie tension remained. The eyes were gone, but the students couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, waiting for the right moment to return. 2 weeks later, at Brookdale High, another lockdown took place. This time, it was during lunchtime. The students were in the cafeteria, laughing and talking, when the familiar announcement rang out. Lockdown. This is not a drill. The cheerful atmosphere of the cafeteria quickly changed. Everyone fell silent, and the teachers ushered the students into the nearest classrooms, locking the doors behind them. Maya and her friends were huddled in a classroom with about 20 other students. They had no idea what was going on, but they could tell from the teachers' expressions that it wasn't good. Then the sound came. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the empty hallways. Maya's heart began to race. Who was out there? The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, through the small window in the classroom door, Maya saw him, a man, tall and dressed in dark clothes, walking slowly down the hallway. He wasn't a student. He wasn't a teacher. And he wasn't supposed to be there. The man stopped outside their classroom. He turned his head slightly, as if listening. Maya held her breath. The room was dead silent, and everyone was watching the man through the window, terrified of what he might do. The man placed his hand on the doorknob, twisting it slowly, but the door was locked. He stood there for what felt like hours, just turning the knob back and forth, back and forth. Maya could hear her heartbeat in her ears, pounding louder with every second that passed. Finally, the man let go of the knob and moved on. His footsteps echoed down the hall until they faded into the distance. But even though the man was gone, the fear wasn't. The students stayed huddled in the corner, too scared to speak, too scared to move. They didn't know who the man was or what he wanted, but they knew one thing for sure. Something was very, very wrong. A few months had passed since the last lockdown at Brookdale High. The students had started to relax again, thinking the strange lockdowns were a thing of the past. But that's when it happened again. It was a cold winter morning, and the students were in the middle of a science class. Everything seemed normal until the bell rang. It wasn't time for class to end, but the bell just kept ringing, louder and longer than usual. The teacher, Mrs. Carter, looked confused. That's odd, she said. It's not time for the bell. As the bell continued to ring, the loudspeaker came on. Lockdown. This is not a drill. The students quickly moved to the corner of the room, their usual routine during lockdowns. Mrs. Carter locked the door and closed the blinds, her face tense. But the bell didn't stop. It kept ringing, louder and louder, until it felt like the walls were shaking. "Why won't it stop?" one of the students whispered, covering their ears. And then, in the middle of the chaos, there was a loud bang. It sounded like it came from somewhere in the school, maybe the gym or the auditorium. The bell stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence. Mrs. Carter looked at the students, her face pale. "Stay calm," she whispered, but it was clear she was just as scared as they were. Another bang echoed through the school, followed by the sound of shuffling feet. It was as if something, or someone, was moving quickly through the halls. Everyone stayed perfectly still, listening to the strange sounds outside. The tension was unbearable, and every second felt like an eternity. What was happening? And who, or what, was making those noises? The bell may have stopped, but the fear had just begun. It was the last week of school before summer break, and everyone was excited to leave for vacation. The students at Lincoln High were in their final class of the day when the announcement came. Lockdown. This is not a drill. The excitement in the air turned into confusion and fear. Why now? Why another lockdown? The students followed the usual procedure, moving to the corner of the room while the teacher locked the door. But something felt different this time. The air felt heavy, like something bad was about to happen. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. A few students screamed, but the teacher quickly hushed them. "Stay calm," she said, though her voice was shaky. The room was silent, except for the sound of breathing. And then, from somewhere outside, came the faint sound of music. It was soft, barely audible, but it sent chills down everyone's spine. The music grew louder, and the students could hear it more clearly now. It was an old, eerie tune, like something from a broken music box. "What is that?" one of the students whispered. No one answered. Everyone was too scared to speak. The music grew louder and louder until it was right outside the door. The doorknob rattled, and the door creaked slightly as if someone or something was trying to get in. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the room in complete silence. The students held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. But nothing came. The doorknob stopped rattling, and the music didn't return. After a few minutes, the lights flickered back on, and the lockdown was lifted. The students left the classroom in a daze, but no one could forget what had happened. Something had been outside the door, something that wasn't human. And even though the school was now empty and quiet, they all knew one thing for sure. The fear would stay with them long after they had left.